so slow. I got time for one more round and a six-pack to go. Tomorrow morning, Sunday, I'm gonna be feeling low. So please, bartender, I want a six-pack.
Hi there, I'm Mark Rabonic, and welcome back to another session of Thinking in the Garage and Drinking Beer. Today I have a really special beer treat. On a recent trip to Pittsburgh, I filled my trunk up with the Yard's Brewing Company Ales of the Revolution. So the beer I just poured was a Jefferson Golden Ale. They also make in that collection a Ben Franklin Poor Richard's Spruce Ale and a Washington Porter. The nice thing, or the unusual things about these beers, is that apparently they do come from the original recipe, and they are quite unique in their flavor, simply because they use ingredients that you usually don't find in beer today. They use local ingredients. They had to substitute for things like malt and so forth. So as you can see, this Jefferson Ale, what a pretty color beer that is, and the taste is just as good. I happened to come across Yards through our dear friends and neighbors across the street, Julie and Jeff. They were telling me about these beers that they had sampled in Philadelphia. And I believe that night they actually had a bottle of the Spruce Ale available. And so I had a taste of it, and I fell in love with it immediately and knew that I had to get some. The problem for most of us in the country is that Yards does not sell this beer outside of Pennsylvania. So a year or two later, after having that taste, my wife and I were on our way to Paris, and we had a 7-hour layover in Philadelphia. So obviously, instead of sitting in the airport, we ended up going into the town, went to Independence Hall, and then for lunch, we went a couple blocks east of Independence Hall in the square to City Tavern. City Tavern was established around the time of the Constitutional Convention. It was where many of the delegates went to eat and to drink, to continue the debate and the discussions, and occasionally there were fisticuffs to settle the arguments. So I was really pleased to go to City Tavern. It was also an opening scene for one of my books that I never did finish, but I still have that scene on my computer and will probably use it at some point in time later on. So when we were at City Tavern, it was a treat. I had colonial turkey pot pie for lunch, which was just absolutely fabulous. And then I had the Jefferson Ale during lunch, and then as for dessert, I had the Spruce Ale. So, just really, really thrilled to have those beers. And fortunately, now I have connections in Pennsylvania that I will be visiting a couple times a year. So, my refrigerator will never be empty of Yards beer and the ales of the Revolution. I can hear, if you hear it now, you can hear the snowflakes. They're getting upset. I'm drinking a Jefferson Ale. Oh my gosh, Jefferson, of course, we know had slaves. And, we shouldn't be drinking these type of beers. Well, Jefferson was an enigma. There's no doubt about it. And I'm very fond of Jefferson. I feel that he was probably the most intellectual, or one of the most intellectual people this country has ever seen. But yeah, no doubt he did have slaves, and I'm not here to answer the question why he did. I know that Jefferson, through his writings, a man that had professed so much about the theory of liberty, to the point of risking his life for it, and yet he owned slaves. But I think he himself saw some hypocrisy in that. And if you read his letters and read some of his exchanges that he had with people, you can see this come out. I know in a letter to John Holmes, who was the architect of the Missouri Compromise, Jefferson wrote the following. He said, "But this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. It is hushed, indeed, for the moment. But this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. a geographical line coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. I can say with conscious truth that there is not a man on earth who would sacrifice more than I would to relieve us from this heavy reproach. In any practical way, the cessation of that kind of property, so it is misnamed, is in which would not cost me a second thought. If in that way a general emancipation and expatriation could be effected, and gradually and with due sacrifices, I think it might be. There is another story that shows, this deep, I guess you would say, hypocrisy within Jefferson. There was a story about a runaway slave from Monticello, and the person returning the slave asked Jefferson what type of punishment he was going to mete out, and Jefferson replied, well, how can you punish a man for wanting his freedom? For those that are interested in really getting into the mindset of Jefferson and also even John Adams, I can recommend a really good book. It's called the Adams-Jefferson Letters, and it's the correspondence between these two great men, and it also includes correspondence from Abigail to Thomas Jefferson. For those that are not familiar with the story, these two families were very close. And then during the election of 1800, which was a very contentious election, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson severed their friendship. It was, I believe, 7 to 10 years before they ever communicated with each other. But Abigail Adams continued to write to Thomas Jefferson, and she and a doctor friend, mutual doctor friend between the two, ended up getting John Adams and Thomas Jefferson together. The letters of Abigail are quite interesting. She is, no doubt, was a well-educated, well-spoken woman. She came right to the point. She was very blunt in some of her letters. One particular letter I liked is during the election that season of 1800, or I think maybe it was a little after, she writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson about his mistreatment of her husband, and she basically tells him to F himself, but in most colorful language and with the most proper use of the English language. So anyway, I would recommend for anybody who wants a deeper understanding of the thoughts of Thomas Jefferson or John Adams or even Abigail to certainly get that book. There is another enigma that I think is going on in society today, and specifically I'm speaking of the left, or what they call the intellectual left in this country. They claim intellectual and moral superiority, and there is no doubt the people on the left are well read. They have knowledge of history, but yet they seem to fall for ideals that are disproven, or they are easily attracted to ideals that come about that in a way maybe make no sense in the end. They have a tendency not to scratch more than an inch below the surface. So, for example, in economic thought, the left now continues this infatuation with the ideal of socialism, even to the point of studying Marx. They call it a new and improved socialism. It's repackaged as democratic socialism. But, of course, people like Hitler and Chavez, they came to power through a democratic process. But they continue to latch onto this ideal that the state is better at running things than the free markets. But we know by the horrific history of Marxism, and it cannot be denied, that hundreds of millions of people died, starved, or lived in constant poverty under this type of economic system. But yet, like I said, the left continues to cling to this ideal that, maybe we can tweak Marx just a little bit. Maybe we can tweak that socialism a little bit to really make it a great system. I've had conversations with friends, and friends that are quite bright, and they will bring up the ideal of Marx. Some of them even feel that after reading Marx that that he had some contribution to economics. And others, feel that, well, his ideals on the value of labor, for instance, had some meaning, or that his ideal on about that capitalists rob actually from their workers. But Marx's ideal of value and his thoughts on capitalism really showed a certain level of ignorance because he just simply did not understand how businesses work, and he did not understand that labor has no value by itself. Labor only has value from the product it produces, and that value is determined by the demand for that product. So, for instance, if you make a product, you work night and day making a product, but yet no one buys the product, well, your efforts had no value. Society did not regard that as a valuable endeavor. If you go out, for instance, and dig a hole, say you take 2 hours and dig a hole in the backyard, you rest a little bit, then you take another 2 hours to fill the hole back in. Well, you've added no value. Yes, you've labored for 4 hours, but you've added no value to neither the soil or to another individual. Also, Marx had the ideal that the capitalist, the entrepreneur, steals, basically commits theft or steals from the workers' labor. But this is a total backwards analysis of what really happens in a business. So, for instance, if I start I'm going to start a fusion restaurant, a Chinese Hebrew restaurant. And in order to start this restaurant, obviously I need savings. I need financial capital to buy the equipment, to get the supplies, to get the food in, to pay the rent, pay the power bill, and so forth. Also, during this time, I've got to hire employees, and I got to train these employees. So this may take 2 weeks or 4 weeks to do. So I'm paying employees for time that is not productive. They are not serving customers. The doors aren't open. So where does that money come from? Well, it comes from my financial capital. It comes from my savings. So workers, the entrepreneur does not take from the workers. It's actually the workers that are taking from the profits and the financial capital of the entrepreneur. And this is something that those who embrace socialism simply do not understand. As Brent Weinstein one time said in a podcast with Jordan Peterson, Marx tells a really good story, but as we know economically and as history has shown, it is very much a failure of a rational economic thought. One is because it fails to take into account the incentive of becoming better off that comes through hard work and innovation. Socialists like to say that there's a flaw in a free market system because, well, there's not equal outcomes. There's inequality. But in order to have equal outcome, the incentives of hard work and creativity must be destroyed. So when you think about it, equality in any endeavor only exists at zero. Now, some friends and some people that I discuss and debate with, they've accused me of somewhat being arrogant when we talk about Marx, and that I am not very understanding of their points of view, and that's probably a fair judgment. But let me put it this way. So let's say that we were talking about the universe, and I bring up the Greek philosophers and the ideal of the geocentric models where the Earth lies at the center of the universe, and I'm trying to make that argument that somehow geocentrism has a contribution to astronomical studies. Well, people would most certainly question my intelligence and in the end probably wonder if I could be that stupid. But even more puzzling with the left's infatuation with socialism is that the very things they enjoy in modern life has come from the free markets. And again, those incentives to make one better off, to make oneself better off, and thus makes society better off. Even when it comes to the poor, and we talk about inequality of income, but one thing we know under the free market system is that our poor today live so much better than the kings and queens of even 100 years ago. The poor in this country have cell phones, they have refrigerators, they have running water, they have heat, air conditioning, modes of transportation, and faster that are faster and efficient than a horse and carriage. They have lights instead of candles. So man has experimented with different economic systems since they first stepped on the planet, and as history has shown, there's no other system that matches the advancement in overall wealth, including the poor, than the free markets. So you have to ask yourself, can people really be this stupid to believe that socialism, with its history, is somehow superior to a system based on free markets? Well, today, as I said, the left will tell you is that, well, we're not talking about socialism. We're talking about democratic socialism, as if you put on a nice dress and put on some makeup, it becomes something attractive. They continue throughout these terms, and such as free education, free health care, free child care. Well, we know there is no such thing as free, and the use of that term actually displays a certain level of ignorance. For instance, watching a sunset on the beach still has a cost to it of what other activities you could be doing. And as I stated in a Facebook post the other day, Bernie Sanders, who I call the socialist moron, actually made an oxymoron when he said that people will be delighted to pay more in taxes for free health care and free education. And then Elizabeth Warren added free child care to the ignorant freebie stew. So I have to ask, can people be that stupid to think that this makes sense, that somehow you're going to pay more with this hand and this hand's going to be free? So taking out opportunity costs, let's take a look at what's really going on in Europe, because people try to portray this Europe and the social welfare systems in Europe as this big one happy-go-lucky system. Oh, wouldn't it be great? I get my free health care. I get my free education. I can sit by the bank of the river. I can just wander the day away, and I will live life happily ever after. But if you take a closer look at what goes on in Europe, you're going to realize that the standard of living for most people in Europe is actually worse than the poor in our country. Take Holland, for example. In Holland, if you have an income at the equivalent of $38,753, you'll pay a marginal tax rate of 40.85%. 40.85% of every dollar over the U.S. equivalent of $38,753, every dollar in excess, you are going to pay almost 41 cents in tax. And then the top marginal bracket in Holland of 51.95% starts at the U.S. equivalent of $78,097. That's not rich by any means. And then on top of it, of the income tax, in Holland they have a VAT, value-added tax of 21%, which also would raise the price of things you buy. So well-being is not based on income. It's not just based on freebies. It is the standard of living is based on your income. It's based on the taxes paid. It's based on the prices you pay, and then the benefits you get from government. And another example is in Sweden. We know in Sweden, for example, people earning over the U.S. equivalent of $36,450 will pay between 49 and 60% in local and state taxes, along with the 25% VAT. And when I was in Europe last summer and talking with our Dutch bus driver, I realized for the first time how high rate these were how high the rates were when we were having our discussions. And my first thought was, well, my gosh, these people don't have a pot to piss in. How can you have any savings if the government is essentially taking 50% to 60% of your wages, and then on top of that, the prices there are so much higher than they are in the United States? Well, it's interesting because Ryan McMakin at the Mises Institute did an analysis that takes into account the standard of living, income, taxes, the cost of items, and social benefits. And what he found out was interesting, and I'm actually going to link this in a separate link on my Facebook page, that in some cases the poor in the U.S. are actually richer than the median income families in many European countries. And sort of anecdotally to this point is that Europe right now is experiencing a heat wave, and they had a similar heat wave in 2003, where air temperatures, they basically rose to what you would consider a normal summer day in St. Louis or maybe Las Vegas or Phoenix. And what happened in 2003 was unbelievable for what you would call a civilized society, a society where people supposedly are so wealthy. And what happened in Europe was the heat wave was responsible for 35,000 deaths and tens of thousands of others being incapacitated. Just think about that in this country. Think about our poor in this country. We have a heat wave. In St. Louis, I remember when we moved to St. Louis in 2012, we had nearly 30 days of 100-plus degree temperatures. As a matter of fact, I know some days it came close to 110. We did not have 35,000 people of any income bracket dropping over that heat. So how is it that if you think this free society in Europe is so beneficial, then think about it. Why would they be dropping because of a heat wave? And so I ask, can people really be that stupid to think that a free system where people in mass die from air temperatures seen on a typical summer day in the United States is superior to a free market system where even the poor can sit inside in comfort? Well, what the left is suggesting is a society where everyone is equal, the incentives to work and create are removed, and government provides every need, and the people live happily ever after. So actually, I would not call the left necessarily intellectually stupid, but I would say that in a degree they're utopians, which is probably a better term, delusional. But we don't need to fantasize what this society looks like because it already exists before our very eyes, and it's called our inner cities. In our inner cities, the residents equally live in squalor. They have no incentive to work or create, and the government gives them free education, free health care, free food, and free housing. And so once again, I ask the question, can people really be that stupid to believe this is how society should look and operate? Well, if you believe that, then you probably would also believe that the slaves didn't have it so bad because they had free food, they had free housing, they had free health care. But we know such an ideal would be absolutely preposterous. So think about it. Do you really, really believe that a system of socialism is better than what we have today? Well, that's it for today. Our little talk has made me thirsty, so I'm going to finish off my brew of Jefferson Ale, and I'll probably knock back one of a Poor Richard Spruce Ale before the afternoon's over. So anyway, until next time in the garage, this is Mark Probonic saying cheers.